In the annals of American folklore, there are whispers of sin-eaters, men and women in remote colonial settlements tasked with consuming the transgressions of the dead, taking on their spiritual burden so the soul could pass into heaven. This practice, rooted in older, darker European traditions, was rarely documented, but its shadow fell over the lonely, isolated corners of the New World. A low, mournful bell tolls, its sound seeming to come from a great distance. In the autumn of 1798, in the fog-choked foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a man named Silas Blackwood purchased a woman who would become a sin-eater of a different kind. He did not buy her for labor in his tobacco fields, nor for service in his decaying manor. He bought her for his sons, and for a silence that had festered in his bloodline for generations. She arrived on a cart like any other piece of human property, a young woman with eyes the color of a stormy sky and a mouth that had not formed a word in years. The slave trader, a man named Finch with a face like curdled milk, claimed she was mute, her tongue having been cut by a previous, crueler master. But Silas Blackwood, a man who understood the intricate architecture of lies, knew that some silences are not carved with a knife, but are built, brick by brick, within the soul. He paid Finch a premium in Spanish silver, not for the woman's strength or her beauty, but for the profound, unshakable quiet that clung to her like a shroud. He named her Alara, a name he pulled from a dusty book of forgotten myths. As he led her toward the great, rotting house that squatted on the hill like a sleeping beast, he did not see a slave. He saw a vessel, a key, a potential cure for a sickness that had already claimed his wife and was now coming for his children. He believed her silence was a container, strong enough to hold the madness that haunted his family's name. What he could not possibly know was that her silence was not a container at all. It was a weapon, waiting for the perfect moment to be unleashed. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? The Blackwood estate was a monument to decay, a place where time itself seemed to have stagnated. Built by Silas's grandfather in a fit of optimistic ambition, the manor had long since surrendered to the relentless siege of the Virginia climate. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, choked the colonnades, and the paint on the siding had peeled away to reveal the dark, weeping heartwood beneath. A permanent dampness clung to the air, carrying the scent of wet earth, rotting leaves, and something else, something vaguely metallic and unwell. Inside, the gloom was absolute. Sunlight struggled through grime-caked windows, illuminating swirling dust motes in the heavy, breathless air. The furniture, once the finest from London, was shrouded in white cloths, appearing like a congregation of ghosts waiting for a sermon that would never come. This was the world Elara entered, a world ruled by three distinct but equally potent forms of despair, Silas's sons. The eldest, Caleb, was a coarse effigy of his father, arrogant, cruel, with a simmering rage in his eyes that he often unleashed on the household slaves for the slightest perceived infraction. He saw Elara as another plaything, her silence a challenge to his authority. The middle son, Jonas, was a creature of fear. Frail and perpetually nervous, he moved through the house like a phantom, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting toward every shadow. He seemed haunted by the very air he breathed, often seen whispering to himself or staring for hours into the tarnished mirrors that lined the grand hallway. Then there was Samuel, the youngest. At 17, he was an oddity, a boy suspended between childhood and the grim manhood his family demanded. He was quiet and watchful, with a morbid curiosity that drew him to things others shunned: the anatomy of a dead crow, the patterns of mold on a cellar wall, and now, the silent girl who had been brought to their home. Silas watched his sons watch her, his expression unreadable, like a physician observing the progress of a terminal disease. He had brought this silent catalyst into their home with a desperate hope, believing she could absorb the poison in their blood. He was about to learn that you cannot introduce a new element into a volatile chemical equation without risking a catastrophic explosion. Elara's duties at the Blackwood Manor were unlike those of the other slaves. She was not sent to the kitchens, the laundry, or the fields. Instead, Silas assigned her a small, sparse room in the main house, a privilege unheard of, and gave her a single peculiar task: to attend to his sons. She was to be their shadow, a silent presence in their lives. She brought them their morning water, laid out their clothes, and sat in the corner of the room during their lessons with a traveling tutor. She did not serve them so much as she observed them, her stormy eyes missing nothing. The other slaves, a small, weary staff of 4, watched her with a mixture of suspicion and fear. They knew she was different. They saw the way the master looked at her, not with lust but with a terrifying, clinical intensity. They whispered among themselves in the dead of night, speculating that she was a conjure woman or perhaps something worse. They avoided her gaze and never spoke to her, honoring a silence they did not understand but deeply respected. Through her unwavering quiet, Alara learned the secret rhythms of the house. She learned that the discordant, melancholic tune that sometimes drifted from the harpsichord in the sealed parlor was played by Jonas in the depths of his anxiety. She learned that the small, meticulously cleaned animal bones that appeared on her pillow were gifts from Samuel, strange tokens of his fascination. And she learned that the guttural curses Caleb spat at her were a mask for a deep, gnawing insecurity that manifested as violence. He could not break her silence, and this infuriated him. He would corner her in hallways, his face inches from hers, his voice a low growl, demanding she speak, beg, or cry out. She would simply stand there, her breathing even, her gaze steady, until his rage sputtered out against the unyielding wall of her stillness. In these early weeks, she became a mirror for the 3 brothers. In her, Caleb saw a reflection of his own powerlessness, Jonas saw a being even more haunted than himself, and Samuel saw a mystery as profound as life and death. None of them suspected that the reflection they saw was one of their own making, a carefully constructed illusion by a woman who understood that the most dangerous secrets are not the ones you tell, but the ones you force others to reveal. The first true test of Alara's resolve came on a sweltering afternoon in late September. The air was thick and heavy, promising a thunderstorm that refused to break. Caleb, having lost a significant sum on a cockfight in the nearby town, returned to the manor in a foul temper, his face flushed with whiskey and humiliation. He found Alara in the library, dusting the spines of books that had not been opened in decades. The silence of the room, combined with her placid presence, seemed to ignite his fury. He grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons, and dragged her from the room. He took her to the edge of the property, where a stagnant, black-water pond lay festering under the ancient cypress trees. The place was shunned by the staff. It was said the water was unnaturally cold, even in the height of summer, and that things lost in its murky depths never surfaced again. "You think you're better than me," Caleb seethed, his breath hot and sour. "You look at us with those dead eyes, judging. I'll make you scream. I'll make you beg for air." He forced her to her knees at the water's edge and pushed her head under the surface. The shock of the cold was breathtaking. The world dissolved into a muted, green-black chaos. Elara did not struggle. She did not fight. She simply held her breath, her body going unnervingly still. Up on the porch, Jonas watched from behind a pillar, his body trembling, one hand pressed to his mouth to stifle a whimper. He saw Caleb pull her up, sputtering and furious that she had not given him the satisfaction of a struggle. He saw him push her down again and again. Jonas wanted to cry out, to intervene, but the fear that ruled his life held him paralyzed. It was Samuel who finally acted. He appeared at the edge of the woods, not with a shout but with a quiet statement. "Father is looking for you, Caleb." He said it was urgent. The mention of their father was enough. Caleb released Alara with a final, contemptuous shove and stormed back toward the house. Alara remained on her knees, gasping, water and mud streaming from her hair. When she finally looked up, her eyes met Samuel's. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod before melting back into the trees. She was alone again, shivering not from the cold, but from the chilling confirmation of what she already knew. In this house, salvation and destruction came from the same blood. In the weeks that followed the incident at the pond, Alara began to explore the manor's secrets with a quiet, methodical purpose. Her silence, which had once been a shield, now became a key. It made her invisible, allowing her to slip through the house unnoticed, a ghost in the machine of the Blackwood family's misery. Her explorations consistently led her to one place, the West Wing, which Silas had ordered sealed shortly after his wife's death 10 years prior. The doors were locked and bolted, the windows boarded from the inside. The other slaves claimed it was for preservation, but their averted eyes told a different story. They spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it the morning wing, and swore that on still nights, you could hear the faint, sorrowful weeping of a woman from behind the barricaded doors. Elara did not hear weeping. She heard music. A soft, fractured lullaby played on what sounded like a clavichord, a fragile melody that seemed to leak through the very walls. It was the same lullaby Jonas would sometimes attempt on the parlor harpsichord, his fingers fumbling over the keys as if trying to recall a forgotten memory. One night, guided by an intuition she could not explain, Alara found a small service door behind a tapestry in the main hall, a door the staff had long forgotten. It was unlocked. Slipping inside, she found herself in a dust-choked corridor that led into the morning wing. The air here was different, cold, still, and carrying the faint, cloying scent of dried lavender and decay. She followed the scent to a grand bedroom at the end of the hall. The room was perfectly preserved, a shrine to a life abruptly ended. A four-poster bed was neatly made. A book lay open on a nightstand, and on the vanity, a collection of silver-backed brushes sat beside a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was from this box that the scent of lavender emanated. Alara lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not jewelry or keepsakes, but a series of small, leather-bound diaries. She opened the first one. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. The first entry was dated 25 years ago. The words on the page described the joy of a new bride, a woman named Isabel, who had just married the handsome and promising Silas Blackwood. But as Alara turned the pages, the tone began to shift, the elegant script growing more frantic, more jagged, documenting the slow, terrifying onset of something Isabel called the family fever. One evening, as a cold, biting rain lashed against the windows of the manor, Silas gathered his 3 sons in his study. The room was his sanctuary, paneled in dark mahogany and smelling of old leather, pipe smoke, and bourbon. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows that made the faces of the men look like grotesque masks. Elara stood in her usual place by the door, a silent sentinel. The boys were uneasy. Their father rarely summoned them all at once unless it was a matter of grave importance. Silas poured himself a generous measure of bourbon, his hand steady, but his eyes held a feverish glint. "You have wondered about this girl," he began, his voice low and resonant, gesturing toward Alara without looking at her. "You have seen her as a curiosity, a tool, a new pet. You are all wrong." He took a long swallow of his drink, the firelight glinting off the crystal tumbler. "Our bloodline, the Blackwood blood, is both a gift and a curse. It has given us this land, this name, this power, but it carries a taint, a fragility of the mind, a fever that can take hold of a man and burn him from the inside out." Caleb shifted in his chair, a look of contempt on his face. "Old wives' tales, father. It took your great uncle," Silas snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "It took my brother, and it took your mother." The mention of their mother silenced the room. Her death had been officially ruled a wasting sickness, but the boys were old enough to remember the whispers, the locked doors, the months she had spent hidden away before the end. "Isabel, your mother, she was not strong enough to bear it," Silas continued, his voice softening with a chilling sort of reverence. "She fought it, but it consumed her. The fever needs a vessel, a place to rest. Our women have always served that purpose. They are anchors meant to draw the sickness into themselves, to quiet the storm in our blood." He finally turned his gaze to his sons, his eyes burning with a desperate, mad conviction. "This girl, Elara, she comes from the same stock as your mother, a specific bloodline known for its resilience, its capacity to absorb. Her silence is a sign of her strength. She is not here for your amusement. She is here to be your anchor, to secure our legacy. She is here to save you." In the oppressive silence that followed, Caleb looked at Alara with a dawning, predatory gleam. Jonas shrank further into his chair, his face ashen, and Samuel watched her with a new, profound, and terrifying understanding. The mute slave was not a servant, she was to be a sacrifice. The first ceremony took place on the night of the winter solstice, the longest and darkest night of the year. Silas had become a fervent student of the occult lore detailed in his wife's journals, convinced that the family fever was not a medical condition but a spiritual entity that ebbed and flowed with celestial cycles. He believed that on this night, the veil between worlds was thin, and the curse in his family's blood was at its most vulnerable. He chose Caleb, as the eldest, to be the first to be anchored. The ritual was to take place in the long-abandoned family crypt, a cold, stone structure half buried in a hill behind the manor. The air inside was frigid and smelled of damp earth and old death. Silas had prepared the space meticulously, lighting dozens of beeswax candles that cast flickering, monstrous shadows on the walls, and arranging strange herbs in silver bowls according to the frantic diagrams in Isabel's diaries. Caleb entered the crypt with a swaggering confidence, fueled by bourbon and a sense of entitled destiny. He saw this not as a grim necessity, but as an initiation, a rite of passage that would solidify his position as the heir to the Blackwood legacy. Alara was brought in last, dressed in a simple white linen shift. She was to be the centerpiece of the ritual, the silent vessel into which Caleb's potential madness would be poured. Silas began to chant, his voice a low, guttural drone reciting passages from a language Elara did not recognize but which felt ancient and wrong. He instructed Caleb to take Alara's hands. As Caleb's calloused, whiskey-damp fingers closed around hers, a strange look passed over his face. Her skin was cool, almost cold, and her grip, though she did not squeeze, felt impossibly strong like the roots of an old tree. He looked into her eyes, expecting to see fear, but there was none. Her stormy gaze was calm, deep, and unnervingly ancient. For the first time, Caleb felt a flicker of genuine fear. It felt as if she was looking not at him, but through him, into the darkest, most diseased corners of his soul. He felt a sudden, dizzying vertigo, as if he were falling into the endless gray depths of her eyes. The candles seemed to dim, the air grew colder, and the silence from her mouth felt louder and more powerful than his father's chanting. He felt something stir within him, a cold, slithering thing that had been sleeping in his blood. He had thought he was the predator here, the master of the ceremony. He was suddenly, terrifyingly unsure. In the days following the solstice ritual, a profound change came over Caleb. The ceremony, which Silas had declared a resounding success, seemed to have unlocked something terrible within him rather than containing it. His arrogance curdled into a volatile, unpredictable paranoia. He began sleeping with a loaded pistol by his bed, convinced that unseen enemies were plotting against him in the shadows of the manor. He accused the slaves of poisoning his food, of whispering curses just beyond his hearing. His cruelty, once a casual expression of his power, became targeted and obsessive. He would spend hours following Alara around the house, his eyes wide and bloodshot, muttering to himself. He no longer tried to break her silence with force. Instead, he seemed terrified of it. He would ask her rapid-fire, nonsensical questions, as if her unspoken answers held the key to his unraveling sanity. "What did you take from me in that crypt?" he would hiss, cornering her in the dimly lit hallways. "What did you put inside my head?" He started spending more and more time by the stagnant Blackwater pond, the site of his earlier cruelty. He would stand at its edge for hours, from dawn until dusk, staring into its murky, unreflective surface. He told Jonas, in a rare moment of terrified lucidity, that something was looking back at him from the water. He said it had his face, but its eyes were wrong, and it was whispering his name, telling him secrets about the fever his father was so desperate to control. The whispers, he claimed, promised him a different kind of power, a release from the confines of his own mind, if only he would step into the cold embrace of the water. Jonas, terrified, relayed this to their father. But Silas, blinded by his desperate belief in the ritual's success, dismissed it as a temporary side effect, a purging of the humors, as the curse was drawn from Caleb's soul into the vessel of the silent girl. He saw Caleb's instability not as a symptom of the fever's victory, but as the final, violent throes of a defeated enemy. He ordered the household to leave Caleb to his meditations by the pond, convinced that he would emerge from this period of turmoil cleansed and whole, the perfect heir he had always envisioned. The house held its breath, waiting. The air grew thick with a sense of impending doom, a feeling that the long-promised storm was finally about to break over the house of Blackwood. The storm broke on a moonless night a week later. A frantic scream tore through the oppressive silence of the manor, a sound so filled with pure, unadulterated terror that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. It was Jonas who had screamed. He had been woken by a tapping at his window and had looked out to see a figure standing at the edge of the pond, its silhouette stark against the starless sky. It was Caleb, standing perfectly still, facing the water. As Jonas watched, his brother took a deliberate, almost ceremonial step forward and disappeared beneath the surface without a splash, as if the water had reached up and pulled him in. By the time Silas and the other servants arrived at the pond's edge, carrying lanterns that threw panicked, dancing light across the scene, there was nothing to see but the still, black water. They called Caleb's name until their voices were hoarse, but the only reply was the chirping of crickets and the mournful sigh of the wind through the cypress trees. They found his body the next morning, snagged on a submerged cypress root not 10 feet from the bank. The local physician, a weary man who had seen too much of the Blackwood family's tragedies, officially ruled the death an accidental drowning, likely the result of a drunken stupor. But the details didn't add up. Caleb was found fully clothed, his boots still on. And his face, that was the thing that would haunt everyone who saw it. His eyes were wide open, his mouth locked in a silent scream, an expression of such profound and absolute horror that it seemed impossible for a mere drowning victim. It was the face of a man who had seen the abyss and had been swallowed by it. In the chaotic aftermath, Alara was questioned by the local constable. She was the silent girl, the strange newcomer, the object of Caleb's recent obsession. He stood before her, a bluff, impatient man, and demanded she tell him what she had seen. She simply stood in the grand foyer, her hands folded, and looked at him with those unreadable, stormy eyes. Her silence was absolute, a perfect, unbreachable wall. The constable, frustrated and unnerved, eventually dismissed her as a half-wit, a simple-minded creature incapable of testimony. But as Silas watched her, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, pierced through his conviction. He had believed she was the cure, but standing there amidst the ruin of his firstborn son, he was forced to wonder, what if she wasn't a vessel at all? What if she was a catalyst? Caleb's death plunged the Blackwood manor into a state of perpetual mourning, but it was a grief steeped in fear rather than sorrow. The house, already a tomb of secrets, now felt like an active crime scene. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. Silas, shattered and desperate, redoubled his focus on his remaining heirs. He saw Caleb's death not as a failure of the ritual, but as a testament to his eldest son's weakness. Caleb had been too arrogant, too impure. His soul had been too corrupted to accept the anchoring. He now placed all his hopes on Jonas, the fearful, sensitive middle son. The father's attention, however, was not a comfort to Jonas. It was a curse. He had always survived by being invisible, by hiding in the shadows cast by his father's ambition and his brother's cruelty. Now, the full, terrifying weight of the Blackwood legacy was settling onto his frail shoulders. Silas began preparing him for the next ceremony, which he scheduled for the coming equinox. He forced Jonas to spend hours in the study, poring over Isabel's increasingly deranged journals, trying to make him understand the sacred duty that lay before him. But the words and diagrams only terrified Jonas more. He started seeing things, fleeting shadows in his peripheral vision, faces in the wood grain of the floorboards. The tarnished mirrors that lined the main hallway became his personal tormentors. He would catch glimpses of himself as he passed, but the reflection seemed to linger a moment too long, its expression subtly different from his own, more confident, more malevolent. He began to believe that something was trapped in the mirrors, something that wore his face. He would stand before them for hours, whispering, arguing with his own reflection, his voice a panicked, desperate hiss. "What do you want from me?" He would cry, his breath fogging the ancient glass. The reflected image would just smile, a slow, cold smile that did not reach its eyes. Alara watched this descent with her usual silent, unnerving calm. She would find Jonas collapsed in front of a mirror, weeping, and would simply stand in the doorway until he noticed her. Her presence seemed to both terrify and soothe him. He began to see her as a fellow prisoner in his father's mad experiment, the only other person who understood the creeping horror that was infesting the house. The weight of his father's expectations and the terror of his own fracturing mind were crushing him, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the fever Caleb had succumbed to in the pond was now coming for him through the looking glass. One night, consumed by whiskey and a terror that gnawed at his sanity, Jonas stumbled through the house in search of Alara. He found her in the kitchen, polishing silver by the weak light of a single candle. He collapsed into a chair opposite her, his body shaking, a half-empty bottle of bourbon clutched in his hand. For the first time, one of the brothers tried to speak to her not with cruelty or morbid curiosity, but with the desperate plea of a condemned man. He thinks you're the cure, Jonas slurred, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. But you're not, are you? You're just watching, you see it all. He gestured wildly around the dark kitchen. This house, it's sick. It's been sick for a long time. It was the fever, it's what took my mother. He leaned forward, his eyes wide with a terrible, drunken clarity. They said she died of a sickness, but she didn't, not really. She tried to fight it for us. I remember. I remember her singing a lullaby to keep the shadows away. A strange little song about a river stone, smooth and gray. He began to hum the tune, a fragile, broken melody. It was the exact same lullaby Elara had heard leaking from the locked morning wing, the one Jonas himself sometimes fumbled through on the harpsichord. The recognition must have shown on her face because Jonas stopped, his breath catching in his throat. "You've heard it," he whispered, a new kind of horror dawning in his eyes. "You've been in her rooms." He didn't wait for an answer. He began to speak of the woman in the walls, a phrase he pulled from the depths of his childhood memory. He described how, in the final months of her life, his mother had been locked away, and he would sometimes press his ear to the wall of her wing and hear her talking to herself, or to someone else who was never there. She wasn't weeping, he explained. She was fighting. She was trying to contain the madness, to keep it from spilling out and infecting her children. Alara listened, her expression unchanging, but a new light was kindling in the depths of her stormy eyes. Jonas had just handed her a crucial piece of the puzzle. The woman in the walls, the lullaby, the fever, it was all connected. Silas Blackwood had not been a passive victim of the family curse. She had been a warrior. And in her journals, she had left behind not just a record of her descent, but a roadmap for its destruction. Silas, oblivious to his son's nightly terrors, pushed forward with his plans for the spring equinox. He interpreted Jonas's increasing fragility and paranoia as proof that the fever was active within him, making the anchoring ritual all the more urgent. He no longer saw his son. He saw only a flawed vessel that needed to be purified for the sake of the family name. The pressure he exerted on Jonas was relentless and cruel. He would belittle him for his weakness, comparing him unfavorably to Caleb's supposed strength, goading him with taunts about his cowardice. "The fever preys on the weak," Silas would say, his voice laced with contempt. "You must be a fortress, Jonas, a man of iron, not this trembling, whimpering child." He confined Jonas to his room for days at a time, allowing him only water and bland food, a purification fast he had read about in one of Isabel's journals. He removed all the mirrors from Jonas's room, believing them to be portals for distraction and vanity, unknowingly taking away the very objects of his son's obsession and terror, leaving him alone with the distorted reflections now trapped inside his own mind. Jonas began to waste away. His already frail frame grew gaunt, and dark, bruised circles appeared under his eyes. He stopped speaking almost entirely, communicating only in monosyllabic whispers. His only moments of respite came when Alara brought him his meager meals. He would watch her, his eyes pleading as if begging her to offer some way out, some escape from the prison of his lineage and his father's madness. He saw the tarnished silver locket she always wore around her neck, a simple, unadorned oval. One day his hand shot out and he grabbed it, his fingers surprisingly strong. He stared at it, his breathing ragged. "It was hers," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the locket. "My mother's." "I remember it." Alara did not pull away. She simply let him hold it, her gaze steady. He fumbled with the clasp, trying to open it, but his trembling fingers could not manage the task. He finally let go, collapsing back onto his cot, a dry, racking sob shaking his body. The recognition of the locket was a breaking point. It was a tangible link to the mother he barely remembered, and the madness he was being forced to inherit. He now understood with chilling certainty that his fate and his mother's were intertwined, and that Alara was not just a witness to his doom, but a keeper of its relics. The house was no longer just haunted by ghosts, it was being run by them. The equinox arrived, carried on the back of a cold, sleeting rain. Silas went to Jonas's room to retrieve him for the ritual, his face set with a grim, fanatical determination. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, and the world dissolved into a crimson nightmare. Jonas was dead. He lay in the center of the room, surrounded by the glittering, jagged shards of a single, massive mirror, the large looking glass he had smashed from the main hallway and somehow dragged into his room. His throat had been opened from ear to ear with a triangular piece of the silvered glass, which he still clutched in his right hand. Blood was everywhere, soaking the floorboards, splattered across the walls, painting a horrific tableau of his final, desperate moments. It was a scene of undeniable suicide, a violent escape from a life that had become unbearable. But as with Caleb's death, there were details that defied easy explanation. On the wall opposite the shattered mirror, scrawled in his own blood, was a single, cryptic phrase: "She sees me." And on the floor next to Jonas's outstretched hand lay Alara's locket. The clasp was broken and it had fallen open, but the space inside where a miniature portrait should have been was empty. It had been empty all along. The physician was summoned once more, his face a mask of weary resignation. This time there was no talk of accident. It was self-slaughter, a clear sign of the madness that had long been whispered about in connection with the Blackwood name. As the body was removed, Silas stood frozen in the doorway, his grand ambitions, his desperate hope for a cure, lying shattered and blood-soaked on the floor. His eyes found Alara, who stood at the far end of the hall, watching. He stormed toward her, his face contorted with grief and rage, and for the first time he laid hands on her, grabbing her by the shoulders. "What did you do?" he roared, his voice breaking. "What did you say to him? What witchcraft is this?" He shook her, but her head just lolled, her body offering no resistance. Her silence was no longer passive. It felt accusatory, like the quiet of a judge who has already passed sentence. In his grief-stricken madness, Silas finally recognized the truth. This girl was not a cure, she was a reckoning. And his youngest son, his final heir, was all that was left. With the death of his second son, Silas Blackwood finally and completely broke from the shores of reason. His grief did not manifest as sorrow, but as a terrifying, cold-burning fanaticism. He was a general with only one soldier left in a war he was determined to win. All of his hopes, his fears, and his deranged obsession with his family's legacy now fell upon Samuel, the quiet, morbidly curious boy who had until now been largely ignored. The manor became a fortress of Silas's paranoia. He dismissed the few remaining house slaves, convinced they were spies and saboteurs. Now only 3 people remained in the cavernous, rotting house: Silas, the master teetering on the brink of abyss; Samuel, the last heir; and Alara, the silent catalyst. Silas's treatment of Samuel became a twisted parody of fatherly concern. He kept the boy locked in the house, away from the corrupting influences of the outside world. He subjected him to grueling lessons on the family history, forcing him to memorize genealogies and recite the grim tales of ancestors who had succumbed to the fever. He was no longer raising a son. He was forging a weapon, a final, perfect vessel for the Blackwood blood. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating, thick with the ghosts of the dead and the madness of the living. The silence that had once been punctuated by Jonas's nervous energy or Caleb's violent outbursts was now absolute, broken only by the sound of Silas's pacing footsteps in the night or the sighing of the wind through the broken eaves. Samuel, in this crucible of grief and obsession, grew strangely calm. He seemed to accept his fate with a placid, almost clinical detachment. He no longer left his strange gifts of animal bones for Alara. Instead, he began to seek her out, to sit with her in silence for hours in the dusty library. It was not the fearful pleading of Jonas or the aggressive contempt of Caleb. It was something different. It was the quiet communion of two people who understood that they were the final players in a tragedy that had been written generations before they were born. Elara, for her part, did not shy away from him. She would watch as he meticulously sketched the patterns of veins on a dried leaf or the anatomy of a spider. She recognized in him a mind that, like hers, saw the world in its intricate, often brutal details. They were two observers at the end of the world, waiting for the final act. One rain-swept afternoon, Samuel led Alara not to the library but to the one place she had discovered on her own, the morning wing. He produced a large iron key from his pocket, his mother's key which he had kept hidden since her death, and unlocked the main door. "Father thinks her spirit is trapped here," he said, his voice barely a whisper as if afraid of waking something. "He's wrong. She's not trapped. She's waiting." He led her through the dust-shrouded rooms to the master bedroom, the cold, still shrine where Silas Blackwood had spent her final days. Samuel walked directly to the vanity and picked up the small, carved wooden box that held his mother's diaries. "I've read them all," he said, his back to Elara. "Father only." Ever read the parts about the rituals, the ones he thought were a cure? He didn't understand. She wasn't trying to find a cure. She was documenting a poison. He turned, his young face old with a sorrow that did not belong to him, and handed her one of the journals. "She knew about you," he said softly. "Not you specifically, but your family, your bloodline." He explained that for generations, the Blackwood men had sought brides from her family line, a small, isolated clan from the mountains known for their resilience and an uncanny connection to the old ways. The Blackwood men believed these women could absorb the family madness, acting as spiritual lightning rods. "But my mother discovered the truth," Samuel continued, his voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. "We weren't giving the fever to them. They were drawing it out of us, not to cure it, to cultivate it, to make it strong enough to finally burn itself out." He opened the journal and pointed to a passage written in his mother's frantic, late-stage script. It described a final, terrible prophecy, that the fever would consume the Blackwood line entirely, culminating in a generation where all the sons would be taken one by the three elements of the family's despair: water for the secrets it keeps, glass for the fractured self, and finally fire for the purification it brings. Samuel looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a terrifying, serene acceptance. "There's one more ritual in her book," he said, "the final one, the one for me." He was not a sacrifice to be saved. He was the final ingredient in a century-long exorcism. The journal in Alara's hands was more than a diary. It was a testament, a weapon, and a prophecy. Silas Blackwood, in her final, lucid moments, had laid bare the entire grotesque history of the two families. The fever was not a simple madness, but a deep-seated hereditary psychosis that manifested in delusions, paranoia, and extreme violence. For centuries, the Blackwood men had sought to control it, contain it, and pass on their name and lands, no matter the human cost. Her own family, the women of Alara's line, had been part of this dark pact for generations. They were not chosen as brides, but as caretakers of a sort. They were meant to be calming influences, their stoic, resilient nature a balm on the frayed nerves of their husbands. But Silas had been different. She was educated, inquisitive, and she refused to be a passive vessel. She began to study the fever, not as a curse to be endured, but as a disease to be understood. Her journals were filled with meticulous, heartbreaking observations. She charted her husband Silas's moods, his bouts of paranoia, his obsession with lineage. She documented the early, disturbing signs of the fever in her own children: Caleb's innate cruelty, Jonas's crippling anxiety, Samuel's morbid detachment. She realized that her role was not to absorb the madness, for that was impossible. The madness was a fire that could not be quenched. Her true purpose, she wrote, was to see it to its end. The lullaby she sang was not a song of comfort, but a mnemonic device, a way to remember the sequence of the prophecy she had uncovered in older family texts. The ritual diagrams Silas so fanatically followed were not instructions for a cure. They were Isabel's interpretations of this prophecy, a roadmap to ruin she had laid out for her husband to follow, knowing his obsessive nature would compel him to walk the path she had designed. Alara's own arrival was the final, critical piece of Isabel's plan. Isabel had written of a silent daughter from her bloodline who would one day come to the house, a witness who would not interfere, who would not try to save them, but would simply allow the prophecy to unfold. She would be the keeper of the story, the one to see the fire burn out and then walk away from the ashes. Isabel had even described the simple, tarnished locket, a traditional heirloom passed down from mother to daughter in her family, as the mark of the witness. Silas had brought Elara to the house to be a sacrifice, but Isabel had summoned her to be an arbiter of fate, a quiet, inexorable force of nature that would allow the diseased Blackwood tree to finally fall. Silas, locked in the prison of his own delusions, knew nothing of Isabel's true design. He saw Samuel's placid acceptance not as a sign of his horrifying destiny, but as proof of his strength and purity. He believed his youngest son was the chosen one, the heir who would finally conquer the family fever and restore the Blackwood name. He began preparing for the final ritual with a renewed, feverish energy. This ceremony, according to his twisted interpretation of Isabel's writings, was the most powerful of all. It was to take place on Samhain, the ancient night when the dead walk among the living, and it was not an anchoring, but a conflagration. He believed it would call forth the entirety of the Blackwood madness and utterly destroy it in a blaze of spiritual fire, leaving Samuel cleansed and immune. He chose the setting with care, the cavernous, stone-floored great hall of the manor, which he emptied of all furniture. In the center, he painted a complex series of interlocking circles and symbols on the floor with a mixture of salt and ash, a design copied directly from the most cryptic pages of his wife's journal. He forbade Samuel from eating for 3 days prior, forcing him to subsist on water infused with bitter herbs. He was stripping his son down, purifying him, preparing him to be the vessel for a final, terrible battle. On the appointed night, the house was deathly still. A hunter's moon hung in the sky, bathing the dying landscape in a pale, silvery light. Silas dressed Samuel in a simple white robe, the same color as the shift Alara had worn during Caleb's ritual. He then brought Alara into the great hall. She was not to be a participant this time, but the sole audience. "You will watch," Silas commanded, his voice trembling with a terrifying ecstasy. "You will bear witness to the salvation of this house." Samuel stood in the center of the circle, his face pale and serene in the candlelight. He looked at Alara, and for a fleeting moment, a look of profound, heart-wrenching sadness passed across his face. It was a silent apology, a final acknowledgement of the role they were both forced to play. Then the look was gone, replaced by an unnerving emptiness. Silas began the incantation, his voice rising, filling the cavernous hall. He lit a bowl of dried herbs in the center of the circle, and a thick, acrid smoke began to fill the room, twisting and writhing in the air like tormented spirits. The final act had begun. The ritual did not unfold as Silas had envisioned. As the acrid smoke filled the great hall, a change came over Samuel, but it was not one of divine purification. A tremor started in his hands, then spread through his entire body. His serene expression dissolved, replaced by a mask of confusion, then terror. His eyes, wide and unfocused, darted around the room as if seeing things Alara and Silas could not. He began to mutter to himself, fragments of sentences, names of long-dead ancestors pulled from the history lessons his father had forced upon him. The fever was not being banished. It was being invoked, brought to the surface in its most potent and undiluted form. Silas, seeing his son's distress, only chanted louder, his voice rising to a fanatical shriek, believing this was the final, agonizing struggle before victory. "Embrace it, my son," he screamed over the roaring fire in the hearth. Let it burn through you. Let it be cleansed." But Samuel was no longer listening. He let out a sharp, animalistic cry and lunged for the brazier of burning herbs, his hands plunging directly into the hot coals. He seemed not to feel the pain, his face contorted in a terrifying rictus that was half grin, half scream. He then turned toward the massive, ancient tapestry that depicted a glorious Blackwood ancestor in a hunting scene, a priceless heirloom that had hung in the hall for a century. With his hands still smoking, trailing embers and the sickening smell of burning flesh, he tore the tapestry from the wall. The dry, ancient fabric caught fire almost instantly. Flames erupted, climbing the wall with an astonishing, predatory speed. The fire leaped to the dry wooden paneling, to the ceiling beams, to the very bones of the house. The conflagration Silas had prayed for had arrived, but it was a literal fire, not a spiritual one. It was the fire of purification Isabel had prophesied. Samuel stood in the center of the inferno, a silhouette wreathed in flame, his head thrown back in a silent, ecstatic laugh. The fever had finally and fully consumed him. He was no longer a boy. He was an avatar of his family's curse, the agent of its final, fiery annihilation. Silas could only stare, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror as the roaring flames devoured his home, his legacy, and his last remaining son. The fire always burns out. Great Hall became a furnace. The roar of the fire was deafening, a hungry, living thing consuming generations of secrets and sorrow. Silas was paralyzed, his mind shattered by the catastrophic failure of his life's work. He watched catatonic as a burning ceiling beam crashed down, striking the spot where Samuel had stood only moments before. His son was gone, consumed by the very flames he had summoned. It was Alara who moved first. The fire, the smoke, the chaos, none of it seemed to touch her. She walked through the inferno with a strange, calm grace, her face illuminated by the destructive light. She took Silas by the arm, her grip firm and unyielding, and pulled him from the hall, leading him out of the house and onto the great lawn just as the roof began to collapse in on itself. They stood on the damp grass, the cool night air a stark contrast to the searing heat at their backs. The Blackwood Manor, the great, rotting monument to a diseased legacy, was immolating itself against the night sky, a spectacular funeral pyre visible for miles. Silas fell to his knees, his body racked with dry, soundless sobs. Everything was gone. His sons, his home, his name, all of it turned to ash and smoke. He was a king of a ruined kingdom, a patriarch with no one left to command. Elara stood beside him, her white shift glowing like an apparition in the firelight. She watched the house burn, her expression not of triumph or of sorrow, but of profound, quiet completion. Her task was finished. The prophecy Isabel had laid out in her journals was fulfilled. The water had claimed Caleb, the glass had claimed Jonas, and the fire had claimed Samuel. The fever had burned itself out. The diseased tree had been purged from the earth. The silence she had carried for so long was no longer a shield or a weapon. It was just silence, the peaceful, empty quiet that follows the end of a long and terrible storm. As the first embers began to die down and the wail of distant voices could be heard approaching, she looked down at the broken man at her feet. She had been bought to be their savior. Instead, she had been their apocalypse. And in the utter destruction of his world, she had, in a strange and terrible way, set him free. By dawn, the Blackwood Manor was a smoking, skeletal ruin. A crowd of neighbors and townsfolk had gathered at a safe distance, their faces a mixture of awe and morbid fascination, illuminated by the dying orange glow of the embers. They had watched the blaze through the night, whispering the old rumors about the cursed family, seeing the fire not as a tragedy, but as a long-overdue exorcism. The county magistrate, a portly, pragmatic man named Elias Thorne, arrived shortly after sunrise. He had known Silas Blackwood for years and was well acquainted with the family's reputation for tragedy and eccentricity. He found Silas wandering aimlessly through the manicured gardens, his fine clothes singed and soot-stained, his eyes vacant. He was muttering to himself, whispering the names of his dead sons over and over again. He was beyond questioning, his mind having retreated to a place where Thorne's authority could not reach. Thorne's attention then turned to the only other survivor. Alara sat perfectly still on a stone bench at the edge of the garden, untouched by the soot and chaos. She was clean, her white shift almost luminous in the gray morning light. She looked like a statue, a pristine artifact salvaged from a devastating ruin. Magistrate Thorne approached her cautiously. He, like everyone in the county, had heard the stories of the strange, mute slave Silas Blackwood had purchased. He had heard the whispers that the family's string of misfortunes had begun the very day she arrived. In the eyes of the superstitious locals, she was the obvious culprit, a witch who had brought this doom upon the house. "You," he said, his voice gruff. "You were inside. You saw what happened. What started the fire?" He stood over her, trying to use his size and his office to intimidate her, to break through the unnerving wall of her silence. Elara slowly raised her head, her stormy gray eyes meeting his for the first time. There was no fear in them. There was no defiance. There was only a vast, ancient calm, the stillness of a deep body of water that has finally settled after a great disturbance. He waited, the silence stretching uncomfortably. The crowd watched from a distance, straining to see the exchange. For the first time in all her years of captivity, Alara parted her lips. Her mouth, which the world believed to be mutilated and useless, was about to form a sound. The crowd on the lawn leaned forward as one, a collective intake of breath. Magistrate Thorne, for all his bluster, found himself holding his own breath in anticipation. He had expected a guttural sound, a pained whisper, perhaps nothing at all. He was not prepared for the voice that emerged from Alara's lips. It was not the voice of a traumatized, broken slave. It was clear, calm, and resonant, with a strange, musical cadence that seemed entirely out of place amidst the smoldering ruins. It was a voice that had not been damaged but had been kept in reserve, saved for this exact moment. She spoke only 5 words. 5 words that sealed the fate of the Blackwood legacy and shrouded her own in permanent mystery. "The fever always burns out." Her voice, though not loud, carried across the lawn with an unnatural clarity, reaching the ears of every onlooker. The phrase was cryptic, nonsensical to the townsfolk who knew nothing of Isabel's journals or the family's private name for their madness. But it was not meant for them. It was an epitaph, a final, definitive closing of a book that had been written in blood and sorrow. Magistrate Thorne was stunned into silence. The words were not a confession. They were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the serene authority of a prophetess. He stared at her, his mind struggling to categorize what he had just witnessed. Was this the babbling of a madwoman, driven insane by the night's horror? Or was it the pronouncement of a witch, openly declaring her victory? The ambiguity was more damning than any confession could have been. He had no evidence, no witnesses who could speak against her, nothing but a field of ash, a madman, and a handful of cryptic words. The law had no tools to prosecute a prophecy. The townsfolk began to whisper amongst themselves, the story already beginning to crystallize into legend. The mute slave had spoken, and her words had been of fire and fever. She had not started the blaze with her hands, they would later say, but with a curse uttered from that silent mouth. They backed away from her slowly, making signs against evil, their fear and suspicion now solidified into an unshakable conviction. She was not a victim. She was something older, something more powerful, something that had come to the Blackwood house not to serve, but to judge. In the end, there was no justice, because there was no crime that could be named. The official report, penned by a bewildered Magistrate Thorne, listed the fire as an accident of unknown origin. It recorded the deaths of Samuel and Jonas Blackwood by fire and suicide, respectively, and noted Caleb Blackwood's earlier death by accidental drowning. Silas Blackwood was declared mentally incompetent and quietly committed to the public hospital for persons of insane and disordered minds in Williamsburg. He spent the remaining 2 years of his life in a small, white room, staring at the walls and whispering to his dead wife, asking her if the fever was gone yet. He died of pneumonia, forgotten by the world he had tried so desperately to master. As for Elara, she became a legal paradox. She was property, and her owner was now a ward of the state. With no one to claim her and no one willing to buy her, for who would purchase a slave widely believed to be a harbinger of death? She simply ceased to exist within the legal framework of the time. One morning, about a week after the fire, she was gone from the temporary holding cell where Thorne had kept her. There were no signs of a forced escape. The lock was intact. The guards had heard nothing. It was as if she had turned to smoke and drifted away through the keyhole. Her disappearance only added to her legend. Some said she had returned to the mountains from which her ancestors came. Others swore she had been a spirit all along, a vengeful ghost sent to balance a long-overdue account. For decades, her story was told around fireplaces in the foothills of the Blue Ridge, a cautionary tale about pride, madness, and the quiet woman who came to watch a great house fall. The Blackwood estate was never rebuilt. The land was sold off in parcels, but no one ever dared to build upon the blackened foundation of the old manor. It was left to nature, which slowly, inexorably, reclaimed the scar on the landscape. The story, like the ruins, was eventually swallowed by time, becoming just another whisper in the long, dark history of the region. A chilling, almost forgotten postscript to the tale was discovered more than a century later, in the 1930s, by a historian researching land grants in the state archives. He found Isabel Blackwood's tarnished silver locket, which had been logged as an item found at the scene, and then misplaced in an evidence box. The historian, using delicate tools, managed to pry open the hidden compartment on the locket's reverse side. Inside, he did not find a second portrait or a lock of hair. He found a tiny, tightly folded piece of parchment. On it, written in a steady, elegant hand, was a genealogical chart. It was not the Blackwood line, but Alara's. It traced her maternal ancestry back for 200 years, and next to each woman's name was another, the name of the Blackwood man she had been married to and the number of sons he had sired. At the very bottom of the list was Alara's name. Next to it there was no husband listed. There was only a single, chilling notation: the debt is paid. The women of her line had not been victims or saviors. They had been keepers of an account, generation after generation, waiting for the one who would finally be sent to collect. If you want more dark historical stories like this, subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America and keep the past from being erased.